Africa. What are its economic and security challenges as it battles COVID-19 and looks ahead? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Naidoo, and this is The Heat. The United Nations Security Council has held an important meeting on Africa. The video teleconference event was chaired Wednesday by China's State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi. The discussion focused on the root causes of conflict in Africa, and it also addressed issues confronting the continent as it deals with the COVID-19 pandemic and plans for the future. We begin with this report from CGTN's Huang Yi from Beijing.
Addressing the open debate, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said equitable and sustainable vaccine rollout worldwide is the quickest and best way to fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the lack of sufficient vaccines in Africa has posed great difficulties for the continent.
African governments themselves have shown great commitment to fight the pandemic by establishing an African task force for a unified continent-wide approach. However, limited supply and access to vaccines and insufficient support for the pandemic response are now hampering and delaying the recovery. Out of 1.4 billion doses administered around the world today, only 24 million have reached Africa, less than 2%.
Guterres called on the international community to remove export restrictions and ramp up local productions of COVID-19 vaccines. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi echoed Guterres' appeals. He said Africa is critical in the world's fight against the pandemic, and the pressing task now is to build a line of defense against the virus there.
The
international community should support Africa in medical supplies, technology, and funds. In particular, the accessibility and affordability of vaccines in Africa need to be ensured through a variety of means, including free assistance, preferential procurement, transfer of technology, and cooperative production.
Wang also called on countries to provide vaccines to Africa on an emergency basis if they're capable of doing so. He noted that China has been providing COVID-19 vaccines to over 30 African countries, and about 46 Chinese medical teams have joined the local battle against coronavirus on the continent. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi emphasized during the open debate that China supports the United Nations in continuing to take Africa as a priority in its work and seeks to jointly promote the peaceful development of the African continent. Huang Yi, CGTN, Beijing.
There's much to discuss, so let's get right to our panel. Joining us now from Cape Town is Lawson Naidoo. He is Executive Secretary of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. Here in Washington, D.C., we're joined by Abdullahi Boru Halakhe. He is an Africa security and policy analyst. And from Beijing, we're joined by Einar Tangen. He is a political and economic affairs commentator. Welcome to the broadcast, all of you. Let me start with you, Lawson. A major theme, of course, was about COVID-19, the vaccine rollout, and as that piece really kind of set the stage for the issues, accessibility, affordability. Give us a sense of what the continent looks like right now when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccines.
Well, good evening. Look, it's a dire situation in Africa with regards to the vaccines. As that insert just showed, less than 2% of the vaccines that have been administered worldwide have been administered in Africa. The initial global response was to set up the COVAX facility to try and fast track and ensure a more equitable distribution of the vaccine. It hasn't really been effective. It hasn't delivered. And, Africa is now lagging behind very severely. And I think what the pandemic has highlighted and demonstrated are the severe inequalities in the world. And, the pandemic and the ability to counter the effects of the pandemic are affecting Africa more deeply than the rest of the world. And before we can look begin to look at a post-COVID economic recovery for the continent and indeed for the global economy, we have to be able to deal with the pandemic in a more equitable way. And I think that is the immediate challenge that we all face. And we know that there have been discussions around patent waivers for vaccine distribution and manufacture on the continent. But those need to move very speedily if we're going to be able to ramp up the levels of production that are going to be required in order to protect the people on this continent from the severe effects of this pandemic.
And Lawson, you said COVAX hasn't delivered. It was much ballyhooed. Is it just a matter of it looked good on paper, poor execution? What do you think's behind that?
Well, I think there are a number of factors behind that. I think part of it is the fact that the Serum Institute in India was earmarked as being the sort of major producer of vaccines that would be distributed under the COVAX scheme. There have been severe problems in the manufacturing ability there. And I think, simply the fact that the vast majority of vaccines that have been made available globally have been swallowed up by the richer Western countries, which have stockpiled vaccines way beyond what is necessary. And the time now is for those countries that have stockpiled vaccines to make them available to developing countries, because until the world as a whole achieves population immunity against this virus, none of us are going to be safe.
And Abdullahi, to that point, according to the IMF's Global Economic Outlook, it says sub-Saharan Africa will be the world's slowest growth region this year. The pandemic, as you know, has already caused so many job losses in so many different countries. Obviously, Africa suffering as well. Just how important is the vaccine rollout going to play in terms of getting the economy going again on that continent?
It will be very important, but I think we just need to step back a little bit and realize that some of the African economies were already struggling before COVID. COVID is now just accelerating what has already been a severe economic reality. If you look at most of the African countries, really, in terms of the economic growth, that growth, has particularly because of the debt situation that most of the African countries are in, the debt GDP ratio for most of the African countries now are I think around 60%, particularly those that are reliant on oil and gas and minerals. It's over 60%. What that means is that there is not a great deal of wiggle room for most of these countries to do anything. So what you're looking at is the economic gains that some of these African countries have recorded since the early 2000s could be wiped out. And that's not just enough. And also the amount of debt that these African countries are accumulated is not the traditional debt that we know from, buy and multilateral institutions. They are largely, they are getting most of these loans from the private market, and that usually comes with higher interest rates. Just to give you a sense, since 2000, African countries have 18 of African countries have gotten into this private market to get loan. Over 150 euro bonds have been issued. That is close to almost slightly under $2 billion US, and these have to be paid. And when your economy is contracting at negative 1.9, that is not something that you can easily say. So what we are facing now is a double, economic and health crisis, which if as we're speaking, the vaccine rollout is incredibly low. Africa is 15% of the global population, and even 1% of that has not been vaccinated. That really points to a fairly bleak picture moving forward.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about vaccines, and of course we'll get into debt just a little bit later in the broadcast. But one of the things I want to talk to you about is something you study quite a bit, which is the insecurity and conflict on the continent. And there are so many root causes, and we'll talk about that as well. But I'm wondering how COVID mixes into that. How much does that provide instability for some of these areas that are so precarious already?
It makes it really difficult. When the state's capacity is incredibly overstretched, it will not be able to provide the kind of security that it can provide. When even during the good times, you look at the African continent, you start from the Horn, where you have groups like Al-Shabaab already causing problems. You look at the West and the Sahelian belt, you look at, at both local and transnational groups causing problems, not just Boko Haram, but we're talking about Mali, we're talking about, in Chad just the other week, the president was killed. It's not just that. Now this problem is also moving down to the south, where in Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado, you're finding, groups that were not there. region that has been spared for, for various reasons, now coming into the picture. So the state is completely overstretched. Its economic capacity is, very thin, and, during this COVID period, some of these groups have taken advantage, and all these things are linked, right? You have a very fragile economy, you have health crisis, and you have groups, that non-state actors that are really using this vacuum or space, if you will, to try and recruit, to try and cause more trouble. Look at example of Cabo Delgado. You have a new, the largest gas that has been discovered, and Total has moved in and tried to, use that probably for the economic recovery, not just of the country, but Cabo Delgado, the region that is, not really doing well already in various matrices, and now that has stopped, and you're looking at, further economic crisis, not just in Mozambique, but in other countries as well.
And Einar, our earlier guests have really kind of set the stage for you, because one of the things that the Foreign Minister Wang Yi talked about was, there is a lot going on the continent. There needs to be a response. There needs to be an international response. He urged that, but he also talked about China. It's providing vaccines to some 30 African countries, as our report pointed out. Medical teams are heading in that direction. He's urging more of an international response. Are people going to listen? Are we going to see some of these international actors actually move to do what China's doing and actually flood the zone, so to speak? And also talk to us about China's efforts so far, and where do you see it going in the future?
Well, Mike, I mean, you cannot have a single country response to all of Africa. I mean, it's just too large. China is trying to lead by example, but it's been very, very difficult and uphill. You have a lot of talk shop coming out of the Biden administration. He's talked about leadership, but so far it's just been about talking about human rights. I don't know what's more important than the ability to eat. You have Africa with a very young population, under 20 years of age. It has really suffered during this pandemic, but it needs a coordinated response. And unfortunately, the U.S. Sense of geopolitical rivalry with China and Russia is preventing it from joining in. And that is really going to cost them. Remember, it's been 75 years since, over 75 years since the end of World War II. If the West and developed countries that were there supposedly leading the world were going to make a difference, we should be seeing it in Africa. Instead, we see steady deterioration. I'm not saying it's all bad. There are parts where Africa itself, in combination with other countries, has made progress. But at this juncture, unless there's a coordinated response and the world comes together, it's only going to prolong the economic and health agony of this pandemic.
Interesting. Lawson, let's go back to you. I want to his point, which he was just talking about. The UN issued a statement noting that the world cannot recover from the pandemic if Africa is left behind. I think we all know that. The World Health Organization also has a lot to say about this. Very strong verbiage coming from them. Let's listen to what they had to say.
The world is in vaccine apartheid. As you know, high-income countries account for 15% of the world's population, but have 45% of the world's vaccines. And low and lower middle-income countries account for almost half of the world's population, but have received just 17% of the world's vaccines. So the gap is really huge.
Vaccine apartheid, those are pretty loaded words. Can the international community be shamed in actually stepping up to the plate?
Well, one would hope so, and it's interesting that that term, vaccine apartheid, is a term that the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, used at a summit in France just yesterday, I think. And it really is, I think it is a question of shaming the international community in terms of highlighting the inequality in distribution of vaccines across the globe. And this is something that, as the previous speaker said, needs a coordinated response. We have, as you were highlighted, this discussion that took place at the United Nations. We've had this Afro-France summit in the last few days in France. We have the Chinese foreign minister speaking out on these issues. But there needs to be a coordinated response. And, unfortunately, the underlying geopolitical issues of the continuing trade tussles amongst the major powers is not helping in that, because they have different interests in economic interests in Africa, different economic approaches to trying to alleviate the problems across the African continent. And unless we get to a coordinated response that also tackles, and I know we're going to come back to this issue, to deal with the issue of debt and liquidity in African markets, it's going to be very difficult for there to be a bounce back from the economic crisis that the pandemic has visited upon us.
I'd like to head to Johannesburg now and invite Gideon Chitanga into our conversation. He's a political economist specializing in conflict and security. Let me ask you, one of the things that I think is lost in this conversation about COVID-19 is actually the success story that we saw in Africa, because many West African countries had dealt with the Ebola outbreak and were pretty much prepped and ready when COVID-19 approached. They were dispatching thermal cameras to airports early on. They were clamping down on flights and gatherings and really kind of tamping down on the spread of this disease. In fact, a number of publications last summer had headlines about this, learning from the best, evaluating Africa's COVID-19 responses. Here's another from U.S. News, what Africa can teach the U.S. about pandemic response. But it's kind of a double-edged sword in the sense that Africa responded well initially, but if they don't get the jabs in the arms, this allows COVID-19 to kind of spread, and now we're seeing different variants. So talk to us about this dichotomy, if you will.
So I think that I see that there are two ways to look at the many responses, and they are very varied, these responses in the African continent, particularly when COVID started. We know that COVID reached Africa and African countries at a little bit later stage. The main response was obviously the regulation package, which was applied by different countries, and each country tended to react in its own way. So they did not have a uniform, coordinated way of dealing with the pandemic as it escalated and worsened. I think that if you take that perspective, you can also think about the scale. It felt like or looked like COVID was very slow to escalate in many African countries. And the pace of the escalation then shifted and hit the peak. That with the initial regulations, which were generally the varied factors of how tightly mobility was regulated in different countries, accounted for the extent and the level of escalation. But COVID peaked in Africa, in many African countries, but comparatively, and I think on a global scale, if you compare the rate, you will see that the level of death and the spread of the pandemic, the scale comparative to the population in different African countries, if you compare to the West, if you compare to India, it's still relatively, comparatively low. I'm not sure of what factors accounts for that. I was in Germany for much of last year, and I came to South Africa in December. When I travel around and go to places, I see the different responses and the vulnerabilities, and it shocks me to compare what I see now and what I saw in Germany, and what accounts for what I feel is still a relatively low scale if you compare in consideration of the living standards, how people, particularly the poor, and is still crowd because they look for resources, the shortage of basic equipment, and so on and so on. And in that sense, I would concede that there must be something different about this continent and the countries in this continent and the populations in terms of how they live their lives and how they relate and so on and so on.
Right.
Even the level of community life. Africans by nature, they group together, they live together in numbers. If I think about the West, you find very small families which generally, even without pandemics, tend to live a comparatively isolated way of life.
So that obviously
there isn't that much.
That obviously contributes to grouping people together. That contributes to the spread, obviously. Abdullahi, let me ask you about this. You brought up debt relief, and I think about what's happening here in the United States with foreclosures. They've put a moratorium on that. There's been steps taken to try and help people who are feeling the sting, but we don't hear a lot of that targeted towards the continent. What are concrete steps you think that can be taken? Because obviously you don't want a country that says, well, we can give the basic necessities to our people, or instead we'll pay off this debt.
I think that that is a very important policy question that we need to begin thinking about. At least over the last slightly over a decade ago, the highly indebted poor countries' debts were forgiven, and the boom that subsequently we saw in most of the African countries is what we've been talking about since 2000 until for the last few years, when that growth, that economic growth, stalled. I mean, for a while we were talking about Africa, seven of the 10 quickest growing economies were in African continent. But now we are going back to the same point because of the point that I raised at the top of the show, where now, for most of the African countries, close to 60%, now the GDP debt ratio is now going over 60-70%. That means you have got no space. You have a country like Kenya now that is taking debt to pay debt. And most of these debt are debt that you are getting from, private markets, comes with significant percentage of interest rates. That makes it very, very difficult for you to be able to do other things. And so that is a policy discussion that you will start hearing as we get closer to the summer, when most multilateral institutions meetings and summits are going to be held. But for most of these African countries, like the previous speaker mentioned, they moved fairly aggressively in terms of closing their borders, quarantine and all that. That was probably why we didn't see a significant number of deaths. But now we are heading into, schools are opening, people are meeting, you have elections where, politicians have to go around and ask for votes. All that will bring a lot of people together. And on top of that, what you notice is the variants now evolving, the virus mutating, and you haven't, had the first, you've just had, less than 1% of the population that have got the first dose. They're waiting for the second dose. Serum Institute in India, is because of what is going on in India, doesn't get that. So you are seeing compounded problems, and that is why, question around, can some of these debt be forgiven? Can some of the interest payment be put on hold? Are questions that, institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and private, lenders will have to wrestle with. Otherwise, what you will see is a series of defaults that you saw, during the financial crash here, but now of countries. And that means, significant number of people, sinking into poverty. And you do not want to see that in the midst of a pandemic as well.
And Einar, Wang Yi talked about China's efforts at debt relief in Africa. Obviously, China's so intertwined on the continent as far as infrastructure investment. What's the view there in Beijing?
Well, I mean, China is taking it cautiously. There's some desire. There has been some debt forgiveness. There's some debt delays and things like that. But I agree with the previous speakers. There has to be some sort of plan that does it, and it cannot simply be China forgiving all the debt that's there. Now, China's a major contributor, but it's not the most contributor. It's number 3 in Africa. There are other nations that are involved. But more than that, I mean, we are all aware of the differences in terms of economics and governance and the effect of climate change on Africa. The key is, what is the plan going forward? And at this juncture, it's fine to say we need relief, but there's got to be a way of doing that. And that has to change. As I said before, for the last 75 years, the policies of trying to insert ideology as part of economics has not been successful. There has to be a way in which African countries can take control of their own situation and be responsible for that. And that means that the world can meet them halfway, but in Africa, there's going to have to be changes in governance and attitudes and more stable government entities if this is going to be solved long term.
And Lawson, what do you see as the plan moving forward? Because as Einar points out, there needs to be a plan.
Well, indeed, there needs to be a plan, and I think, you know, the last speaker also highlighted the two different aspects of this. There are things that within Africa, across the continent, that we need to tackle and deal with, and that includes, you know, internal responses to conflict situations across the continent, internal responses to issues around governance and respect for human rights. And those are internal issues that Africa has to address. But alongside that is the role of the broader international community in helping to stimulate the African economies. How do we globally come out of the economic crisis that the pandemic has created? Debt relief is, of course, one part of that. There's been a call from the summit in France over the last couple of days, a concerted call on the IMF to release additional funds under the special drawing rights that countries hold with the IMF to provide the kind of liquidity and investment in the African economic markets that is going to be required in terms of agricultural production, in terms of IT development, to enable the African economies to resume the levels of growth that we saw pre-pandemic, which is not to say that, you know, we weren't facing a crisis even then, but the crisis has been compounded now because of the inequalities that exist.
Gideon, he mentioned this summit in Paris where French President Emmanuel Macron called for a new deal for Africa. He wants about $100 billion headed in triple its funds actually for Africa. Is that going to be enough? I mean, what do you see as the need?
So it's very important to craft a new deal to commit more resources to Africa, and specifically to look at the different situations in African countries, because Africa is not one country, there are different countries. But I'm also just thinking that as we think about the economy broadly and how it could be rebooted and investments into the African markets, it is important to think about how African countries can produce the vaccinations, particularly within Africa. One major issue is that the production ecosystem of the vaccines themselves continue to systematically be unequal, just like the global economic structure that has been variously referred to. And I think with reference to how the US approaches this issue and what other contributors have said with respect to human rights and issues of governance, there is need to rethink the frameworks that have applied over the years, because you cannot be insisting, for instance, on human rights in a context where there is a pandemic. You need to rethink how human rights and governance systems, which are problematic, can be addressed.
Well, we're actually going to have to leave it there. I apologize. We've run out of time. This is a nice, robust discussion, but we've run out of time, and that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for joining us.